The signal did not come with a warning. There was no flash in the sky, no shaking ground, no dramatic buildup that movies had always promised. It simply arrived, quiet, clean, and everywhere at once, cutting into every television, every phone screen, every radio, every digital billboard in every city on every continent, all at the same moment, as if the whole planet had been wired to a single switch and someone had finally flipped it. 6,500 languages, one message. The translation was not perfect, but it did not need to be. The meaning was clear enough. A voice, deep, flat, and stripped of any warmth, told the people of Earth that they had been observed, that their world had been assessed, that its resources, its position in the star system, and its population had been catalogued and found useful, and that, as of this transmission, the Vreth Dominion, rulers of 47 conquered worlds, was extending a formal offer of surrender. 72 hours. That was the time given. Surrender all governance structures, hand over population registries, open orbital space to Vreth inspection vessels, resist and face what the voice called corrective bombardment. The term was clinical. It was meant to be. Then the signal cut. Every screen went dark for exactly 3 seconds before returning to normal broadcasts, as if to let the silence do its own work. It worked. Within 20 minutes, the first riots had started in 3 cities. Within an hour, 17 governments had issued emergency declarations. Stock markets did not just fall, they stopped functioning entirely, exchanges suspending all trading as the numbers turned meaningless. People filled the streets of capital cities. Some prayed, some screamed, some simply stood and looked at the sky as if they expected to see a fleet already hanging there above them. The sky looked the same as it always had. In Geneva, inside the glass and steel building that housed the United Nations Emergency Assembly, the chaos was quieter but no less real. Delegates pressed phones to their ears. Aides rushed between doors. Translators sat motionless at their stations, still processing what they had just heard in every language simultaneously. At the center of the long, curved table, the Secretary General called for order 3 times before the room settled into something that resembled it. Proposals came fast. Negotiate, stall, broadcast a countersignal, attempt contact on a different frequency. One delegate stood and suggested with remarkable composure that humanity simply comply, that survival under occupation was preferable to extinction. Several others nodded. None of them noticed that Admiral Dara Osai had not said a word since the meeting began. She sat near the far end of the table, a compact woman in her early 60s, with short gray hair and the kind of stillness that tends to make other people nervous without them knowing why. She was not looking at the screen where the alien message had played. She was looking at her hands, folded on the table in front of her, and the expression on her face, the one that a few sharp-eyed delegates would later describe when journalists asked them about that day, was not fear. It looked, they said, almost like relief. When she finally spoke, she did not raise her voice. She simply said, "I need the room cleared of all non-essential personnel." The Secretary General blinked. "Admiral." "Everyone without level 7 clearance or above," she said. "Now, please, this is not a debate." Something in the way she said it, not loud, not aggressive, simply certain, moved people before the order was even properly processed. Aides and assistants began filing out. Delegates without the required clearance looked at each other in confusion and then, slowly, followed. Within 4 minutes, the chamber held 17 people instead of 200. Dara stood. She pressed 2 fingers to the table and a display rose from its surface, not the usual assembly feed but something different. A private network, encrypted, running on a separate system that had never been connected to any external line. Director Yusuf Adlan stepped forward from where he had been standing against the back wall. He was tall, lean, and somewhere in his mid-50s, with the particular calm of someone who has spent decades carrying a secret so heavy that he had long since stopped feeling its weight. He placed a small drive into the table's port. The display expanded. The people still in the room stared at what appeared on it. It was a map not of Earth but of near space. Earth orbit, lunar space, the asteroid belt, Saturn's moons, and across that map marked in green were hundreds of points, installations, structures, vessels, things that had no business being there according to any public record, any official inventory, any document that any government on Earth had ever acknowledged. "What is this?" the Secretary General asked. Yusuf spoke quietly. "We call it the Quiet Initiative. It has been running for 80 years. He paused to let that land. "What you are looking at is what humanity has been building in the dark, across every administration, every change of government, every decade since we first intercepted fragmentary signals from the Vreth Dominion moving in our direction." The silence in the room was total. "The Vreth gave us 72 hours, Dara said. She looked around the table at the stunned faces, the wide eyes, the mouths that had stopped mid-question. "I want to be precise about something." She tapped the display. A small counter appeared in the corner of the map, a readiness clock, and it was not counting down. It had already reached 0. "The Quiet Initiative's readiness clock hit 0 14 months ago," she said. "We have been waiting for them to make their move, not because we had no choice, but because we needed them in position." She straightened. "The 72 hours they gave us is not our deadline. It is theirs." One minister, a sharp-faced man from a northern European nation who had spent 30 years in defense policy, leaned forward slowly. His voice, when it came, was barely above a whisper. "They have no idea, do they?" Dara looked at him. She did not smile, but she did not deny it either. Somewhere in orbit above them, running without a single emission signal that any Vreth scanner would recognize as intentional, the platforms of Operation Ironville shifted a fraction of a degree, patient, precise, and utterly invisible, and waited. Aboard the Vreth flagship Dominant Claim, the silence on the bridge was a comfortable one. Fleet Speaker Gorath stood at the curved observation rail and watched the blue-white sphere of Earth rotate slowly below him. It was a small planet, wet, crowded with signals. Their communications were so loud, so unshielded, so carelessly broadcast in every direction that the Vreth had been reading them for decades without any effort at all. A species that talked this much and this openly had never learned what it meant to be hunted. That told him everything he needed to know about them. His intelligence officer, Sen, approached from the left, a lean, quiet figure who moved carefully and spoke carefully, which Gorath had always found mildly irritating in someone whose job was to deliver assessments. "Fleet Speaker, Earth has transmitted a response." Gorath did not turn. "What did they say?" Sen read from his screen. "We acknowledge your message and are reviewing our options. We will respond in full before your deadline." Gorath said nothing for a moment. Then he made a sound that served in Vreth as a short laugh, low, dismissive. "Reviewing their options." He finally turned. "They have no options. They are reviewing the size of their fear and trying to decide which words will make it seem smaller." He moved toward the central display. "Order a full sensor sweep of their orbital space. I want a complete catalog of what passes for their military presence up here before we proceed." The sweep took 11 minutes. The results came back and Gorath studied them with the mild interest of a man reading a document he already expected to be dull. Satellites, a small inhabited station, civilian, by the energy signature, a handful of research probes in varying orbits, some debris fields, no weapons platforms, no fleet, nothing that registered as a meaningful threat on any scale he had encountered in 47 conquest operations. He was turning away from the screen when Sen spoke again. His voice was careful in a different way this time. "Fleet Speaker, there are some anomalies in the sweep data." "Define anomalies." Sen pulled the data up on a separate panel. "Several dense energy signatures in the asteroid belt that do not match natural rock composition. A cluster of communication nodes near Saturn's largest moon, low emission but structured. Not random, and on the dark side of Earth's moon, he paused. Large subsurface cavities, arranged in patterns that are not geological. Gorath looked at the data. He looked at it for a longer moment than he intended to. Then he looked at his second-in-command, Fleet Blade Urak, who was standing nearby with arms folded and the expression of a soldier who had grown comfortable with certainty. "Sensor ghosts," Urak said. "The sweep is calibrated for Vreth infrastructure. Human construction would register oddly. The readings are distortion, nothing more." Gorath considered this. It was the logical answer. In 47 prior operations, no species had managed to conceal anything meaningful from a standard Vreth sweep. The sweep was not designed to miss things. He told himself that. "Flag the anomalies for secondary review," he said to Sen. "Continue standard approach." Sen nodded, but he did not close the panel. On Earth, in a facility buried 40 meters below a mountain range in a country whose name appeared nowhere on any of the Quiet Initiative's official documents, Yusuf Adlan was watching the Vreth sensor sweep in real time. The Wraith Array, a network of signal-bending nodes woven through the inner solar system over the course of 20 years, had deflected most of the sweep's active pulses. Not all. A few genuine readings had leaked through. He watched the analysis and noted that the Vreth had flagged 3 of the real installations. Then he watched them dismiss those flags within 4 minutes. He wrote one line in his log and closed it. They decided they did not see anything. Good. In a different part of the same facility, Commander Petra Voss was running the final systems check on Operation Ironville. She moved through the checklist with the unhurried thoroughness of someone who has done this so many times that the actions have become physical memory rather than conscious thought. Platform by platform. 340 of them, seeded across the orbital sphere over the course of 18 years, disguised beneath panels of real orbital debris, paint-matched, mass-matched, radar cross-section matched to the natural scatter of junk that humanity had conveniently spent decades placing in orbit. They were, to any external scanner, simply garbage. They were not garbage. Each one carried a directed energy emitter and a kinetic launch system, powered by a compact reactor and governed by an autonomous targeting intelligence that had been running continuous passive updates for 11 months. As Petra moved through the check, she noticed something that made her stop. The platforms had been adjusting their positions on their own. Not randomly, not due to drift, precise microcorrections made over 72 hours, tracking the slow movement of the Vreth fleet's approach vector with millimeter accuracy. She had not ordered this. No human had. The targeting intelligence had identified the fleet's trajectory, calculated the optimal firing geometries, and quietly repositioned itself to maximize coverage, all without being asked. She stared at the adjustment logs for a moment. Then she moved on. She was not worried by it. She was, if anything, impressed. Yusuf found her 20 minutes later and handed her a single printed page, a summary of the Wraith Array's intelligence harvest from the Vreth fleet's internal communications. The Dominion's ships were not using tight beam signals. They were using a broad-spectrum internal network, probably because it had never mattered before. The array had been reading it for 16 hours. Petra looked at the page. It showed the Vreth fleet structure, the flagship at center, the fuel depot ships positioned aft, the communications relay vessels spread wide, and the bombardment platforms moving into forward positions on an 18-hour delay. "They're going to want to be in bombardment range early," she said. "Show the humans what they're about to face. Let it sit. Let us panic." Yusuf nodded. "Which means they will advance past the optimal firing corridor approximately 14 hours before the deadline." Petra set the page down. "How long until the Warden ships need to move?" "I've already sent the signal," he said. Far out beyond Neptune's orbit, in a region of space so dark and cold that no Vreth scanner had ever been tasked to look there, 14 vessels received the one-word message and began, slowly, silently, without a single active emission, to turn. They had been out here for years. Some of the crew had been rotated through twice. They had lived in the dark for a long time, and they were very ready to stop. Back in orbit, the Vreth fleet drifted forward. Goreth watched Earth and thought about the 47 worlds before it, and how none of them had surprised him, and how this one probably would not either. Sen, at his station, watched the flagged anomaly data and said nothing. He just kept watching. The trouble with predicting a species you have never truly studied is that you fill the gaps with what you already know. Goreth had conquered 47 worlds. He had seen courage and cowardice, desperation and dignity, species that fought to the last, and species that opened their gates before the fleet had finished entering orbit. He believed by now that he knew the shape of how intelligent life behaved when it understood that death was coming. There was a pattern. There was always a pattern. What he had not seen was a species that behaved as if the death were coming for someone else. Earth's second transmission arrived at the 48-hour mark, 18 hours before the Vreth deadline. It was not addressed to the Dominion. It was a global broadcast, sent outward across every human channel, clearly meant for Earth's own population. The Vreth fleet's translators caught it immediately and routed it to Goreth's screen. The woman who appeared on it was not young. She did not wear a military uniform. She stood in a plain room in plain clothing, and she spoke directly, without notes, without the trembling energy of a person trying to hold themselves together in front of a camera. Her name, the translators confirmed, was Dara Osai. She was listed in human records as the head of the UN's Joint Defense Coordination. She was, by function, the closest thing humanity had to a supreme military commander. She did not plead, she did not promise survival, she said. We have faced extinction before, disease, war, our own failures. We faced all of it and we are still here. Whatever comes next, we face it together, trust us. That was it, no stirring speech. No list of achievements, no appeal to the watching aliens to show mercy, just a quiet instruction to her own people, trust us. Goreth watched it twice. His second-in-command, Urak, watched it once and declared it the speech of a species in denial, the last comfort offered by a leader who had no real options and knew it, but could not bring herself to say so. Goreth was not so sure. He called for Sen. The anomaly data, he said, the belt signatures, the lunar cavities, the Saturn nodes, has secondary review completed. Sen set a report on the display. Yes, fleet speaker. Secondary review confirmed the readings as likely distortion artifacts from Vreth sensor calibration encountering low-grade human construction materials in unexpected locations. The conclusion is that the structures, if they are structures, are non-military. Possibly industrial, possibly research. Possibly, Goreth repeated. The confidence level on the dismissal is 83%, Sen said. And the other 17. Sen was quiet for a moment. The other 17% is the part that keeps me at this station at night, fleet speaker. Urak cut in from across the bridge. 17% doubt based on imperfect sensor data is not an operational concern. We have bombardment arrays ready to fire. The only thing stopping us from ending this conversation right now is the protocol that requires the deadline to pass first. He turned to Goreth. They are not hiding a fleet. No species at their development stage could. Their radio communications for the past 2 days have been pure civilian noise, panic, prayer, political argument. There is no military coordination signal in any of it. That is correct, Sen said. There is no military coordination signal. He said it in a tone that made the absence of one sound less like evidence of helplessness and more like evidence of something else entirely. Goreth heard the difference. Urak did not. On Earth, Petra was watching a different kind of absence. She sat in the Ironville command room, a space carved into the same mountain facility as the main Quiet Initiative hub, and she studied the Vreth fleet's positioning data as the Wraith array fed it to her screen in real time. The fleet was moving, not quickly, but moving, tightening its arc around Earth's orbital plane, adjusting for bombardment geometry. It was moving exactly where the firing tables had predicted, 10 years ago, that any rational attacker would move. She pulled up the Pale Corridor status board. The lunar railgun network, 114-barrel installations, embedded so deeply into the rock of the lunar far side that no surface scan would find them, fed by reactors that had been sealed and running on automated maintenance cycles for 6 years, reported green across the board. The barrels had been angled and locked for 31 hours. They were not waiting for a command to aim. They had been aimed for over a day. Yusuf came in and stood beside her without speaking. He looked at the board. She looked at the board. For a while the only sound was the quiet hum of the facility's air system. "The Warden ships?" she asked. 16 hours from final position," he said. "And Dara?" "Watching the Vreth fleet's approach. She's been in the observation room for 6 hours." He paused. "She asked me to tell you something." "What?" She said, "Don't let them get comfortable." Petra turned back to the board. She picked up the handset for the Ironville network and spoke a single code phrase. Across near-orbital space, 340 pieces of what looked like debris shifted almost imperceptibly. Not enough to trigger any change in a Vreth reading, but enough that every firing solution was now corrected for the fleet's new position. The platforms did not need to be told twice. The targeting intelligence had already calculated the corrections before she called. She had essentially called to confirm what the system had already done. Elsewhere in the vast, unlit distances that the Vreth had not thought to scan, 14 dark vessels finished the last phase of their approach arcs and went absolutely still. They held position at 6 points surrounding the Vreth fleet, spread across an enormous sphere. Outside any range, the Dominion sensors were actively watching. Their crews had been briefed for years. They knew the plan better than some of them knew the faces of their families. They waited. The Vreth 24-hour warning broadcast went out on schedule. It was louder than the first. It carried imagery, this time footage of other worlds that had refused and what had happened to them. Goreth had approved this himself. He believed in giving the conquered a clear picture of the alternative. It shortened the process. The footage ran on screens across Earth. People watched it in silence. Some wept. There were no more riots. The first surge of panic had burned through, and what remained was something heavier and quieter. Goreth watched the reaction feeds and saw what he expected to see: a population in shock. A species looking into the face of something it had no answer for. He was satisfied. He gave the order: advance the fleet to bombardment range. He wanted to be there early. He wanted humanity to see the ships close enough to count. In the Quiet Initiative's observation room, a small screen showed the Vreth fleet begin to move forward. Dara Osai, who had indeed been sitting in that room for 6 hours, watched the movement for a moment. Then she picked up the secure handset beside her and entered a 12-digit code. On the other end of the line, far out in the dark, 14 commanders received the code simultaneously. Each of them, in their own way, had been waiting years for this call. The line stayed open. There was no speech, just breathing and engines waking up, and the long quiet of space being crossed very deliberately from every direction at once. The last thing Goreth expected, in the final hours before a bombardment, was to feel uncertain. He had felt it before, briefly, on the 7th world he had ever conquered, when a small resistance cell had managed to destroy one of his transport ships as it landed. That had surprised him. But the cell had been destroyed within hours, and the world had fallen within a day, and he had filed the uncertainty away in a place he rarely visited. This was different. This was a quietness coming from the planet below that he could not explain and could not dismiss. Human military radio signals had been dead for 16 hours, not reduced, not encrypted beyond what the Vreth decryption systems could handle. Dead, completely absent, a species in the final hours before orbital bombardment with no military coordination traffic at all. It was either the deepest surrender he had ever seen or the deepest discipline. He was still deciding which when the first platform woke up. It did not look like a weapon. Nothing in the debris field it had been hiding in for 11 years looked like a weapon. But when the disguise panels released, 340 sets of them, simultaneously, across the entire orbital sphere surrounding the Vreth fleet, the sound of it on the sensor screens was like a wall of noise hitting a room all at once. Goreth had enough time to say one word before the firing began. He said, "What?" The first strike took out the shields on his forward escort vessel. Not a glancing hit. A direct convergence of 3 directed energy beams from 3 different angles, timed to arrive within milliseconds of each other so the shield could not cycle between impacts. The escort vessel did not explode. It went dark dead in the water, all systems offline, tumbling slowly. Then the second wave hit. The Vreth fleet scattered on instinct. It was the correct tactical response when caught in a multi-directional engagement. Goreth had trained his commanders well. Scatter, regroup, establish a firing line. Standard doctrine for an ambush. He had drilled it into them on 17 campaigns. They scattered directly into the pale corridors firing solutions. The lunar far side opened. Not visibly, there was nothing visible about it, just rock and dark and the ancient silence of a moon that had been waiting there for 1 billion years. But from below that rock, along barrel shafts that were 1 kilometer long and perfectly straight, kinetic slugs launched at a velocity that made the word fast feel inadequate. They crossed the distance between the moon and the Vreth fleet in seconds. 3 capital ships were hit before their shields had finished cycling up from the first wave. One took the strike in the propulsion section and began to spin. Another was hit amidships and simply stopped, not destroyed, just stopped, as if a giant hand had grabbed it and held it still. The third lost its command deck and went dark at the helm. The fleet tried to return fire. It tried to find targets, but the platforms were small, dense, and scattered across a sphere so wide that pinpointing them while also being struck from the moon below and maneuvering in debris was an overlapping demand on the fleet's combat systems that no simulation had ever prepared them for. Then the Wraith array activated. It did not make a sound. It did not produce a flash. It simply reached out through the entire inner solar system, through nodes placed in asteroid tumbles and on dead cometary bodies and in the orbits of moons that nobody had looked at closely for years, and it squeezed. Every active sensor signal the Vreth fleet was broadcasting, every scanning pulse, every navigation ping absorbed, scattered, bent, returned as ghost data. Within 40 seconds, the fleet was flying blind. Goreth gripped the observation rail. The screens were full of false readings and then no readings at all. He could hear the damage reports coming in from every direction. He could not see the planet below. He could not see the debris field around him. He could hear his fleet moving and could not tell if they were moving toward the enemy or away from it or into each other. "Restore sensors," he said. "We are trying, fleet speaker," someone called back. "The interference source is distributed. We cannot locate a point to target." "Then target the planet's surface." "Fleet speaker," that was Sen. His voice was very controlled. "The bombardment arrays are not responding to firing commands. The targeting systems are reading signal conflict. They cannot lock on." The Wraith array was not just blinding the Vreth. It was feeding false signal data into every system that depended on external reference points. Targeting required knowing where you were. Right now, the fleet did not know where it was. And then, from 6 different directions, at distances that should have been empty space, from orbital planes that no Vreth scanner had been pointed at, the warden ships appeared. They did not announce themselves. There was no broadcast, no warning shot. 14 vessels dropped from dark running simultaneously and took up position around the surviving Vreth fleet in a containment sphere so precise that it looked like it had been arranged with a compass and a ruler. Because it had. The geometry had been calculated 10 years ago and updated every 3 months as technology improved. The warden ships were not beautiful. They had been built in darkness over decades, by engineers who had never cared what they looked like. They were dense and angular and heavily plated, and they carried weapons that were not copies of any alien technology. They were entirely human-designed, built from first principles for exactly this engagement, against exactly this type of fleet. The tractor arrays came online. Not weapons, not exactly. Systems that reached out and grabbed the drifting Vreth capital ships and held them still, grabbed the escort vessels that were trying to regroup and held them apart, grabbed the fleet piece by piece and simply stopped it from being a fleet. The whole engagement had taken 11 minutes. Gorath's flagship shuddered as a tractor lock settled around it. The lights on the bridge flickered and then steadied. Emergency power. He looked at his screens and saw nothing useful. He looked at his crew and saw people who were very good at their jobs and had no idea what had just happened to them. Sen walked to Gorath's side. His face was doing something Gorath had never seen on it before. It was not fear. It was the expression of someone whose private calculations had just been confirmed at enormous cost to everyone around him. "They have tractor locks on all surviving vessels," Sen said. 17 ships non-responsive, 11 immobilized, the rest locked in place. He paused. "We are not destroyed, fleet speaker. They have deliberately not destroyed us." Before Gorath could answer, every communication screen on the flagship, and on every Vreth vessel in the containment sphere, lit up with the same image. The woman from the second transmission, Dara Osai. She was standing in what looked like a plain room. She was not in battle armor. She looked, if anything, exactly as she had looked in the broadcast, calm, unhurried, as if the 11 most intense minutes in the history of space warfare had not just occurred and she had simply been waiting for a kettle to boil. She said, "You gave us 72 hours. We used 22 years. She let that sit for a moment. "Now shall we talk?" The bridge of the Vreth flagship was silent except for the sound of structural settling and damaged systems venting. Gorath looked at the screen. He looked at the woman on it. He thought of 47 worlds and the pattern he believed he understood, and he felt the pattern come apart in his hands like wet paper. He said, and his voice, to his own surprise, came out steady, "How long have you been preparing for this?" Dara's answer was a half-smile, not triumphant, not cruel, just quiet like everything else about her. "Since before your dominion found us," she said. The Vreth had a word for the moment after conquest that did not translate well into any human language. The closest approximation was something like the settling, the period when a newly taken world finally accepted its situation, and the noise of resistance gave way to the practical business of occupation. Gorath had experienced it 47 times. It had a particular feel, the surrender of momentum, the cooling of chaos, the long exhale of a conflict that was now simply history. What he felt, sitting across a table from Dara Osai and Yusuf Adlan aboard a warden vessel, was the opposite of that. This did not feel like a settling. It felt like the floor had stopped, and he had not. They had brought him aboard a ship called, according to the hull designation, Persistence. It was not a comfortable vessel. It had not been designed for comfort. The meeting room was small, the lighting was functional, and the two humans across the table from him looked as though they had spent the last several days doing exactly what they had been doing and were simply continuing to do it. No ceremony, no display, just a table and chairs and a small projector between them. Gorath had brought Sen. He had not brought Urak, who was still aboard the flagship in a state that the Vreth did not have a polite word for. The meeting was under ceasefire. Both parties had agreed to this in a terse exchange of signals in the 40 minutes between the end of the engagement and the shuttle docking. Gorath studied the humans the way he always studied new species when he had the chance, carefully, without appearing too. Soft bodies, short-lived by any galactic standard, still capable of angry disagreement with each other, even now, even in this room. He had observed Dara and Yusuf exchange a sharp look over some procedural question before he had sat down, divided within themselves, contentious, loud historically, even in their silence. And yet, "I want to understand," he said, "not a demand, a simple statement. How did this begin?" Yusuf placed both hands flat on the table. 80 years ago, he said, a radio telescope array in the southern hemisphere of our planet captured a fragment of a Vreth communication signal, not directed at us. It was simply traveling through this region of space, a conquest report, we later determined from a campaign approximately 200 light-years from here. He paused. It took us 9 years to fully translate it. When we did, we understood 3 things. 1. The Vreth Dominion was real, organized, and capable of interstellar travel. 2. The direction of its expansion was, on a long enough timeline, going to include us. And 3. We had perhaps a century. Gorath said nothing. "We spent that century building," Dara said. "Not waiting, not hopping, building. Every nation contributed, though most governments were not told the full scope. It was funded inside civilian infrastructure budgets, disguised within scientific missions, layered into commercial orbital contracts. Administrators who asked too many questions were given answers that were technically true and practically misleading." She paused. "It required a level of institutional patience that most people would call impossible. And yet here we are," Sen said quietly from behind Gorath. Gorath glanced back at him. Sen was looking at the table with the expression of a creature who had suspected something like this, and was now experiencing the specific discomfort of being correct. "Why not simply attempt diplomacy?" Gorath asked. The answer came from Petra Voss, who was standing near the door, not at the table, not introduced as a negotiator, simply present, in the way that a person is present when they have earned the right to be in a room. "We watched what your dominion did to the 47 civilizations that tried exactly that," she said. "We read the records. We translated the conquest reports. We watched the pattern." She looked at him steadily. "We decided we did not want to be the 48th. Gorath was quiet for a moment. "You have been studying us for 80 years. "In detail," Yusuf said. He reached into a folder beside him and set a bound document on the table. It was thick. He slid it across to Gorath. The fleet speaker opened it. He read the first page, then the second. He turned to a section in the middle and read it. He turned to the back. He read the last page. It was a full intelligence assessment of the Vreth Dominion. Fleet deployments. Internal political fractures between the Dominion's ruling council and its client state governors. Resource dependencies, which systems the Dominion could not function without and how close several of them were to exhaustion. The names and known positions of every senior fleet speaker currently on active campaign. Supply chain routes. Fuel depot locations. It read like something that had been compiled by someone who had been inside the Dominion for decades. Which, in a sense, the signal's intelligence had been. Gorath set it down. He said nothing for a long time. Outside the small porthole beside the table, he could see the containment sphere, his fleet, immobilized, held in place by systems he had not known existed 24 hours ago. "You could have used this," he said. "Years ago, you could have destabilized the Dominion from the outside, political interference, economic disruption." "Yes," Dara said. "But you did not." "No." "Why?" "Because destabilizing the Dominion without the capability to defend ourselves from the response would have accelerated the timeline," Yusuf said. "We needed to be ready before we acted, so we waited until we were ready and then we let you come to us." He folded his hands. "You came to us." Gorath looked at him. In 47 campaigns, he had never sat across from a conquered species, and felt that he was the one who had been managed. It was, he decided, an extremely unpleasant experience. "You said," Gorath began slowly, "that you deliberately did not destroy the fleet." "Correct," Dara said. "Why?" "Because we want you to take something home." She reached into the folder and produced a second document, thinner, cleaner, precisely formatted. She set it on the table and slid it to him. "This is a ceasefire framework. Its terms are not complex. Earth's sovereignty is recognized in perpetuity. The Dominion withdraws from 3 border systems it seized from a 3rd civilization in the last 40 years. She tapped the page. "And one clause at the end which I ask you to read carefully." Gorath looked at the last clause. It was written in plain language. Humanity reserves the right to respond to any future threat with all measures available, including those not yet disclosed. He read it twice. He looked up. "There is more," he said. It was not a question. Dara said nothing. Yusuf simply closed the folder. Petra, near the door, looked at a point somewhere past Gorath's shoulder with the focused non-expression of a person choosing not to confirm or deny something they know the answer to. The silence in the room lasted a long time. Outside, the containment sphere held the fleet of the Vreth Dominion in perfect stillness. Beyond it, Earth turned below, blue and quiet and absolutely unmoved. Gorath picked up the ceasefire document. He looked at the last clause one more time. Then he asked the question that had been building in him, since the moment the first Ironville platform had shed its disguise. "How many of you knew about all of this? Your own people, how many?" Dara looked at him. There was something in her expression that was not quite regret but lived in the same neighborhood. "Not enough," she said, "and too many, both at different times." She paused. "We are not a species that keeps secrets easily. Keeping this one cost us things we do not have a number for." Gorath nodded slowly. That at least he believed without reservation. He signed the ceasefire framework. The Vreth fleet left in the way that damaged things leave slowly, asymmetrically, trailing the quiet evidence of what had happened to it. 17 ships had been rendered non-operational and were being towed by the others. 3 capital vessels had no functioning helm and were being guided out by escort craft on manual external tether. The formation was nothing like the one that had arrived. It had arrived as a statement. It left as a question. Gorath sat in his command chair and did something he had not done after any of his previous 47 engagements. He opened the historical archive, the running record that the Dominion maintained of every conquest operation, the official account that would eventually be reviewed by the ruling council, filed, and used as a training reference for future campaigns, and he began to write a personal addendum. Not a report, a description. He described the humans without contempt and without awe. Both of those, he had decided, were forms of inaccuracy, and the archive deserved accuracy. He described what the humans had built and how they had hidden it and how long they had waited. He described the Ironville platforms and the lunar railgun network and the Wraith array and the Warden ships, and he described the engagement in precise terms. And he described meeting Dara Osai across a table on a vessel called Persistence and reading an 80-year intelligence file about his own dominion. He did not describe how it had felt. That was not the kind of thing the archive was built for. He left that part for whoever read between the lines. At the very end, he wrote a single sentence that he had been turning over in his mind since the moment the ceasefire document left his hands. There is a clause in their agreement stating that they may respond to future threats with measures not yet disclosed. This is not a bluff. Do not treat it as one. He filed the addendum. He closed the archive. He watched his damaged fleet move through the dark. On Earth, the weeks that followed the Vreth engagement were complicated in the way that large truths are always complicated when they arrive all at once. The quiet initiative was made public, not all of it, but enough. The existence of Ironville, the Pale Corridor and the Warden Program was announced in a joint global address by the UN's Inner Council. The reaction was exactly as divided as Dara had predicted it would be. There was relief, enormous, shaking relief, the kind that makes people sit down in the middle of whatever they are doing because their legs have stopped working. There was also anger. Organized, legitimate anger from governments that had been kept in the dark for decades, from populations who felt that decisions this large should not have been made without their knowledge, from oversight bodies that were only now discovering the scale of what had been funded inside budgets they had approved without understanding. Both reactions were fair. Dara said so publicly in 3 separate hearings. She answered every question she was permitted to answer. She did not deflect and she did not apologize for the decision itself, only for the cost of the secrecy. There was a difference, she explained, between regret and reversal. She regretted the cost. She would not pretend in hindsight that there had been a better path. Most people, after a while, found that they could hold both things, the anger and the relief, without one canceling the other. This took longer for some than for others. Petra Voss was given command of a vessel called the Long Consideration, the first official deep space contact ship in Earth's history, not a warship, not a research probe, but something built specifically to carry a message to other places. She spent 2 months on the mission brief before departure. The mission was to locate the remnants of civilizations previously conquered by the Vreth Dominion and make contact, to deliver copies of the ceasefire framework, to offer what could be offered: technology, frameworks, the simple fact of existing as proof that the Dominion could be stopped. She was not sure what she would find. Some of those civilizations had been under Dominion control for over a century. Some might not want help. Some might not have survived in any form worth reaching. She was prepared, as much as a person can be, for difficulty. What she was not prepared for was the first signal that came back to Earth from the outer territories, 3 weeks after her departure. It was not from a conquered world. It was from a species that had been paying tribute to the Dominion for 60 years, had heard what happened at Earth, and had decided to attempt a communication that it had never dared to try before. The signal contained one question, translated 12 different ways to ensure one of them would parse correctly. Hello. Over the following months, similar signals arrived from 11 other civilizations. Some sent more than a question. Some sent diplomatic overtures, trade proposals, careful requests for information. Some sent only silence, followed eventually by a single acknowledgement that they had received Earth's transmission and were considering what it meant. One sent a word that did not translate precisely but landed, in the estimation of the translation team, closest to something like, "Finally." It was not a triumphant time on Earth. It was a busy, difficult, careful time, the kind of time that looks like history from the outside, but feels like pressure from the inside. Systems that had been secret needed to be integrated into legitimate governance frameworks. Pilots and crew who had operated in classified conditions for years needed to be processed back into a world that now knew they existed. New international structures needed to be built around capabilities that had never been publicly accounted for. In the middle of all of this, in the command facility on the lunar far side, the Pale Corridor's main hub, now openly acknowledged and fully staffed, Yusuf Adlan and Dara Os found a quiet hour. They stood in the observation room, the one with the wide window that looked down at Earth, and they drank something hot and did not talk for a while. The planet below looked as it always had, blue, white-streaked, turning slowly. It had looked the same when the Vreth signal first arrived. It had looked the same during every hour of the engagement. It looked the same now. 3 of the other programs are still running, Yusuf said eventually. Not a question, not a revelation, just the continuation of a very long conversation. Yes, Dara said. The Council will want briefings. They will get them, some of them. Yusuf looked at the planet for a moment. The 40-year one, The one you named before any of the rest of it existed, before you thought you'd ever see the day. He turned to her. What do we call it when someone asks? It will come up. Dara did not answer immediately. She was looking at the stars above the planet's curve, the part of the view where Earth ended and everything else began. The part that, 80 years ago, a radio telescope had aimed a receiver at and heard something coming. We called it the second countdown, she said. Yusuf nodded. He had always known that. He had been there when she had named it, a long time ago, when they had both been much younger and the Warden ships had been blueprints and the Ironville platforms had been diagrams on a whiteboard in a room that officially did not exist. And what are we counting down to? He asked, not because he did not know, because he wanted to hear her say it. Dara looked at the stars for a while longer. Whatever comes after the breath, she said. Whatever heard what happened here and is deciding right now what it means. She paused. Whatever is already on its way. Outside, above the lunar facility, the containment sphere was gone. The Warden ships had returned to their berths and were being resupplied. The Ironville platforms were back in place, resettled into their debris disguises, running passive and silent and patient. The pale corridor's barrels sat still in their rock housings, angled at a sky that was, for now, quiet. For now, nobody had thought to ask what humanity was counting down to. In hindsight, that was the Vreth Dominion's only real mistake, and the very last one they ever made where Earth was concerned.